A pioneer in public finance since 1955, Ellers helps clients build outstanding places to live, work, learn, and play by delivering focused, fully integrated financial advisory services. We work with more than 1,500 local governments, schools, development authorities, and public agencies, placing their needs and best interests at the heart of everything we do. We help our clients navigate all facets of public finance, including financial management planning, economic development and redevelopment, debt issuance and management, investments and treasury management, and arbitrage consulting. At Ellers, we believe strong communities aren't simply the result of transactions. They're the result of people. We build strong, long-lasting client relationships, collaborating with your staff to complete projects and drive new initiatives forward. Building strong, vibrant, and sustainable communities. Together, it's what we do. For more information, call us at 1-800-552-1171 or visit ellers-inc.com.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Ellers' virtual session to discuss economic development planning. My name is Keith Dahl, Municipal Advisor with Ellers, and I'll be serving as your moderator today. Before I introduce my colleague and we get started, I just have 3 quick housekeeping items to mention that will help ensure that you have a good interactive experience with us today. You'll notice in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, there are 2 icons. One is called Live Q&A and the other is Chat. As we move forward through today's presentation, if you have a question you'd like to have us answer, simply open up the Q&A tab, type it in, and submit. We'll take a few breaks during our time together to answer these questions you've submitted. You can also have conversations throughout the session with your fellow attendees by opening up the chat function. One thing to note, while we have questions in the box and you can anonymously answer, in the event we're unable to get to all of these questions today, we recommend you allow us to see your information so we can reach out to you directly with specific answers. Lastly, if at any point during our presentation you start to notice either video or audio lag, please feel free to go ahead and refresh your browser, and that will get you right back on track. Now that we've covered those items, let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Jason Aarsvold, Senior Municipal Advisor with Ellers. Thank you, Jason. Take it away.
Thank you, Keith, and good morning, everybody. As Keith said, I'm Jason Aarsvold with Ellers, and we've entitled our session today From Vision to Fruition. And, this session is really born out of some interaction and discussions that we've had with several different communities about sites and or projects that they may have that are going to probably require some kind of city assistance in order for them to be successful. And so in an attempt to try and, have a discussion around that, the question that we always get is, okay, well, if I'm going to need to participate in this project, what's the best way to move that forward? How do I get that project from our vision, to its fruition, to a completed project? And, there's no one way to go about that, but, we've found that there are some kind of best practice steps that you can think about and, things you can do in order to make sure that those are more successful and you're more likely to succeed in your efforts. And so these are a few of the things that we just want to cover today to help answer that question. And, first we want to talk a little bit about preparing for success. This is the planning part of the endeavor here, we think is very important. And then move into talking about ways in which you can attract development in your community. And, we think that falls into a couple different buckets. You can be proactive about that or reactive about that. And then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about working with developers and some important things to keep in mind with respect to working with your developers that are out there. And then, also important in this process is protecting your local resources. Obviously, anytime you enter into a process whereby you're going to be participating financially, you want to make sure you're protecting your resources. And then finally, and I think most importantly, we've got some great examples about how these principles translate into real life projects and successes that are out there. So just starting off, again, as the session talks about there's an important piece of this that is considering your plans and making some plans, doing some strategic planning to make sure that you know what it is you're trying to accomplish. And, there are several reasons why you would want to start with this, as your jumping off point for considering any project. But there are just a few reasons listed here. And I think first and potentially most importantly is making sure that you as staff and your elected officials are all on the same page about the kinds of things that you want to do and assist with respect to your development in your city. So, this makes the process a lot easier. It helps that for staff to know that your elected officials have provided you with specific direction about the kind of things you should be out there pursuing. And it just makes the whole process run much more smoothly. And it's going to provide a foundation for making sure that you have successful projects that are moving forward. You will know that when a particular developer, for instance, comes forward with a project, you're going to be able to think about how that relates back to the plans that you've established and understand whether the elected officials are going to find that to be a project that they would like to assist. And again, it just helps keep things much more smooth in the process. Also, you'll know then when someone does come to your desk or to your office or call you on the phone, that you're going to be prepared when those opportunities arise. And one of our examples that we have today really speaks to that preparedness and being able to capitalize on opportunities when they do present themselves. It's often difficult to try and respond to some of these requests when you haven't had these conversations with your elected officials about the kinds of things that you'd like to assist. And then finally, this exercise in planning can really help set your priorities, because we all know that we've got limited resources that are out there. And that's both in terms of time, right? Staff time, and in money, dollars. And so, we always talk about the fact that, even if you make a good deal for a particular project, if it's not a project that advances the goals that you've set for yourself, was it really worth the time, effort, and energy that you spent working on it? And then what flows out of your discussion about your strategic planning are sets of policies. And, just to know that when you before you enter into this phase and you do your strategic planning, that exercise does not need to be onerous, right? You just need to set aside the time to have the discussions. And we've worked in communities that have spent, multiple meetings and months developing their strategic plans, to those that have really just spent 1 or 2 meetings having discussions broadly about the kinds of things that, your elected officials would like to assist. The important part of it is really just making sure that you're having that discussion in some form. The complexity, the extent, and all of that is really up to each individual community, and really, the level of engagement that you think your elected officials want around that. But in any case, what will flow out of that then are some policies and procedures that are going to help guide you through these processes when you do have a project that's ready to move forward. And I can't stress enough how having these items in place really does help simplify and create a process that's going to be predictable for everybody involved, from the developers to the staff to the elected officials. And when we talk about these policies, one of the first ones on the list there is what's called your business subsidy policy. Now, state statute requires that anytime we're going to provide a business subsidy, funding to a particular business, that we need to follow the provisions of that policy. And one of the things that says is that every city contemplating providing a business subsidy really needs to prepare one of these policies. And there are some very specific things that need to go into that. There are local job and wage goal requirements, as well as some just broad things that need to go in there just by matter of what the statute requires. Now, you can include additional local goals in that policy, and that's something that we actually recommend. So when you have that broader conversation with your elected officials, that's your opportunity to include additional things that you want to accomplish. And that can be a wide range of things that are out there. You can have more intensive job and wage goals. You can have architectural standards, or just a whole host of things, just depending on what you as a community want to accomplish. And including those is important. It signals to the development community what it is you want to accomplish as a community. if you're going to be participating financially in any project. And then a few other policies that I think are important to think about. One is a developer fee policy. So if you have a developer or a business for that matter approaching you to ask for some kind of assistance, it's good to have them submit a fee to help cover any third-party costs that you might incur, as a result of reviewing that request. And that's no different than what cities do now for planning requests, for example. It's just allowing you to have funding to pay for any legal and or financial analysis time that needs to be done to evaluate that request for assistance. That way, the city's not responsible for that. These requests come in and it's unpredictable, so it's very difficult often to actually budget for that. So you may not even have a budget to pay for these expenses. So having this policy in place is a way to make sure that you can have the resources in place to review appropriately these requests. And what then accompanies that is an application. So you have a way to, if somebody approaches you and asks you, look, we'd like you to consider assistance for this particular project. Sometimes you get the deer in the headlights look, right? It's like, well, what do I do now, right? Well, if you have an application that specifies the procedure that you're going to follow as a city to evaluate these requests, it becomes very easy. You can hand that off to the individual requesting the assistance, and you can say, look, here's the application, here are the steps you need to follow, and these are the pieces of information that we need in order to evaluate that request. It sets some very clear expectations, and then it makes it a lot easier for the staff to be able to process these requests in a way that is consistent and fair to everybody requesting the information. And I'll say that, one of the benefits in doing this, and I'm sure many of you have had this experience, is that, you may have somebody that would like to do a project and continually is asking questions and wondering why you're not helping them and taking up a lot of your time. But what the nice thing is with these application processes is that you can say, look, yeah, we're happy to consider your request. You need to fill out this information. You need to submit a fee, and then we will process it in a way that, gets us moving forward. The nice thing about that is it helps weed out those folks that aren't that serious and are maybe a drag on a lot of the time that you're trying to spend on other things that you'd like to do. Then, when you do get one of these applications, you do get a fee submitted, you have somebody there that's very serious about their project. They view that they've got something that is workable, and they really truly do want to move it forward. And then just lastly, you can think of there are a lot of other communities that have all kinds of different policies, and they're really just based on whatever you decide your local needs are, right? A lot of folks now are looking at affordable housing policies, and this is a place to include those pieces of information. You can talk about, any local goal you're trying to accomplish and putting those in place to make sure that the staff knows what it is the council wants to accomplish. Once all that's together, you've got your goals that are out there. You've gotten an application that's consistent with those goals. You've been able to review that application. It really becomes a function of knowing what tools are out there to help facilitate development. I'm not going to spend a lot of time reviewing every one of these in detail, but we know sort of what the usual suspects are that are out there. Most commonly, what we're looking at when we are helping to fund a project and participating locally as a community, there are EDA and HRA levy funds that are out there, local revolving loan funds that many communities administer. Tax increment financing and tax abatement really end up being, the lion's share of all of this, and probably the two biggest that are most commonly used. But of course, there are many other sources of funding that are out there, grants that come at the state, county, federal level, and as well as, many communities are also considering potentially fee waivers as another source that's out there. When we start talking about attracting development, as I said, I think that kind of falls into two buckets, just for the sake of discussion. The first is proactive. So we work in many communities where there are elected officials and staffs that want to be proactive about promoting development on a particular site. So there, you're involved in a city-driven developer recruitment process. You as a community are out there trying to find somebody to build what it is you want, bring your vision to fruition on a particular site. And I think that, that's pretty straightforward. The other way, you might have a guy come to your office, like that's on the left there, and he might say, hey, look, I've got a great project, but it's going to need city assistance. And that, in our mind is sort of you're reacting. It's a reactive way to respond to these requests. And so you're really taking what they've presented to you and needing to react to that. And that truly is where having your plans, policies, procedures in place are going to serve you well in terms of being able to respond to those requests. So starting first, just going into a little more detail about what that looks like when you're trying to proactively attract development into your community. So these are listed really in the order of most to least effective. And, what we've found is that direct outreach to developers for the specific use that you'd like to see on your site generally tends to be the most effective way to attract development in those cases. So those, you're asking developers to, come in to meet. Obviously, in the last year, we've been doing some of these even virtually, the way we're doing this right now. But just having a conversation about your site, talking about some of the pros and cons, and learning more about how it's viewed by the development community. And, we found that developers are willing to spend an hour of their time talking with you. That's very easy for them to do. You can gain valuable feedback through that process. And really, it often serves as a marketing tool as well, because you build awareness that you have an opportunity out there. And if there are challenges that are present in the site, the developer knows that they have a potential partner to help overcome those financial challenges. The second listed there is an RFP and RFQ process. I'm sure many of you have looked at doing processes like that. That's really, you prepare some information about your site, you distribute that broadly to the development community, and you ask them to prepare a response to that, indicating their interest in developing a particular site. And, I think that can be workable in some instances, but what we find is generally developers do not like to engage in that process. It's not like spending an hour of their time. They're needing to spend, probably several hours of their time and engage the resources of their entire firm to put a proposal together, and all without knowing whether they really are likely to, gain the business, or how many people they might even be competing against. And so, we've seen instances where communities have gone to the trouble and time and expense to conduct one of these processes, only to find that they get 0 responses back. Now, that isn't always the case. And the distinction I make in my mind is if you have a site that is, really a gem and is going to be very desirable by the development community, then maybe this process makes sense. But often when we engage in these processes, we're dealing with sites that haven't been developed for some particular reason. And usually it's because there are challenges present and people aren't knocking down the door to build on these sites. And that's why RFPs tend to be a little less effective in those cases. And then finally, we've worked with places too that have just simply decided to try to hire a broker and sell or dispose of property to, whatever might be the highest and best use. And so there, you have a little less control over, what you'd like to see happen. And, depending on the site, that also can lead to 0 proposals from time to time. So it really just is site dependent, but all of these are potentially effective ways that you could think about engaging proactively in development in your community. When we flip over to being more reactive, again, as I said there, as a staff level, typically reacting to somebody proposing something in your community, and generally asking for a request for financial assistance. And, as a staff person, that can be sort of a daunting thing, right? You've got a use that, may or may not be controversial that's being proposed. But then on top of that, you may be having somebody that's asking for millions of dollars in local assistance in order to make this project work. And so, the question always becomes, geez, how do we deal with this in a responsible manner and in a way that, may lead to ultimately to development that the community may like to see on this site? And again, this really comes back to having those strong plans and policies in place. And we like to point out, when we get to this place, you want to have these, right? You've already done the work. Hopefully, this infrastructure essentially is already there, and then you can really fall back on that to guide how things happen moving forward. It's always difficult, we've found, to try and both have the conversation with the elected officials about the philosophy about what they would like to help and assist with broadly in the community, while simultaneously dealing with a request for a specific project. It creates a lot of challenges and isn't a great situation. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but if it can be avoided and you have the opportunity to put these plans and policies in place ahead of time, all the better. So we get to this point, when we start working with the developer, just real briefly here, we've done full-blown sessions on how to work with developers, but whether you start your process as something that's proactive or it's been this reactive process, these processes, when you get to the point of actually having a project in front of you, sort of converge. And from there, how you deal with those projects becomes kind of the same, right? So we start with that application process, and what we need from the applicant or the developer or the business, whoever the person requesting the assistance in the project might be, is some information. We need to be able to evaluate the request and understand, is it appropriate or not? And so we're asking them to provide a whole host of information, right? We want numbers of the budget of the project. We want to understand the operating. We want to understand the specifics around the dollars that they're requesting. We want to know why they're necessary. We want to know information about the people involved in the business potentially. And so your application will cover all of that and ask for all of that information. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to collect those dollars, that escrow, hopefully, to cover those costs of analyzing that application, so that if you need to engage services of an advisor for financial consulting, you can do that. If you need to engage legal assistance, you have the ability to do that. All of those things are going to help tell us whether a project really should be moving forward to consideration by your elected officials or not. And once we get to that point and we've got sort of approval or agreement from your elected officials that you have a project that's ready to move forward, then now you're into the process of actually working with a developer. And these are just a few things to keep in mind to keep that relationship functioning effectively. As I said, we could spend an hour talking just about this, but just some of the highlights. Involving your elected officials early is critical. Making sure that they understand how we are getting from point A to B to C to completion is important. If they feel like they're coming in late or in the middle of a process and aren't up to speed, it can be challenging going forward for the project. Quick decision making is also an important piece of this. And, we often talk about this in terms of avoiding the slow no. That is, from a developer standpoint, the worst thing that could happen, right? If they're okay if you as a community don't want to engage with them in the project that they're proposing, but they would like to hear about that sooner rather than later, because we're going to be asking them to spend a lot of money preparing plans and pictures and numbers that we can use to evaluate their request. All of those things cost money for the developer, and they're willing to spend it, but they'd also like to know that they potentially have a path to get their project done and are able to do that. Clarifying the developer's request early. And what I mean by that is just making sure that you understand fully what it is the developer is asking for. And there's one example that we'll show later on here where that was important, right? Make sure, if they're asking for, several $1 million, let's understand exactly what that is. Why do they need that? Do they, what is it that they're really asking for? Is there something that we're not thinking about? Do they assume that they're going to have fees waived and those aren't going to be paid, or that they weren't going to have to pay park dedication fees or something like that? You don't want to get, 3/4 of the way down the road and find out that there was a misunderstanding about what the assumptions were for the project. That can also be something that derails projects and leads to, their failure. Again, keeping lines of communication open. This is, should be relatively straightforward, but just constant dialogue. Again, avoiding surprises, making sure that you know what the developer is asking for, making sure they know what you need, making sure all of that is being communicated back to the elected officials. It's just going to help avoid surprises. And then finally, setting clear expectations. And this one should be obvious, but making sure that everybody understands that development is really an iterative process. It's not static. It's not like going and procuring a good off the shelf, right? These projects will evolve, and it's important that everybody understands that. What we always say is, whether it's through an RFP process or through sort of a proactive developer recruitment process, a developer is going to show you its first cut, its first site plan, its first rendering of a particular project. We always say that is absolutely not the project that's ultimately probably going to get built on that site. And I think everybody needs to be clear about that so that we don't get fixated on the first picture that we see, for example, and think that that's the way things need to be on a going forward basis. So that sort of broad thing applies to every aspect along the way as it relates to development. So being flexible, making sure that everybody understands that, important to success. And then a little bit here about the importance of protecting local resources. So, I'm not going to go into great detail about this. We have a full session coming up in 2 weeks, May 5th, on this topic, right? We're going to spend an hour talking just specifically about this topic. But clearly, anytime you're asked to participate financially in a project, you want to make sure that you're doing the best to protect your local resources, being good stewards of your tax base. And so, again, that's another reason why we asked the developer to submit an application. It'll contain all the information we need to evaluate that request and make sure that you can structure something that's appropriate for your particular community. Again, this is just ensuring that your project qualifies for the kind of assistance that you're being asked to provide. You're going to take and conduct what we call a pro forma analysis. That's really going to be the meat of the topic that we talk about on May 5th. And then you're just making sure that all of the sources of funding that are available are being maximized and that you're minimizing what you need to provide as a public entity to make the project work. So before we jump into any of the case studies and specific examples, we're going to take a short break here and for questions.
All right, Jason. Well, it looks like we have a few questions right now. I'll go ahead and ask the first one. What are some key terms or conditions you see other communities put into their respective policies?
Sure. Yeah. If you're preparing a business subsidy policy and you want to include local, local goals in there, I touched on a couple, but we see specific higher job and wage goals. For example, your policy is required to put a floor or a minimum, but you may have as a goal to have higher wages paid, for example, if you're going to provide assistance for a project, and you can include those right in your policy. Job density is another one. So, you may get assistance for a warehouse distribution project or a manufacturing project. And there are, more jobs per square foot typically in a manufacturing building than there might be in a distribution facility. And so, if a goal of your community is to have more jobs per square foot, for example, we see that kind of thing go into a policy. You can even bring housing items in there, as I mentioned. You can talk about the need to provide different levels of housing, different types of housing. It can be affordable. It can be, it can be life cycle housing. It can be senior housing, all of those sorts of things. We see architectural requirements get put into place. So if you want to, make sure that buildings that are being built are adhering to a certain standard or a certain design guideline, those sorts of things can be put in there. There really isn't any limit. It's really just based on the goals and imagination of the particular community.
Perfect. Thank you, Jason. All right, another question here. So it sounds like there's a community that already has a policy in place, but how often should they update it?
Sure. In terms of updating it, I think it's important, just like anything, right? I mean, once you've created that policy, you've met, assuming it's a business subsidy policy, you've met the requirement in statute. There's no there's no requirement necessarily to go back and revisit that, but priorities will change in your community. Circumstances will change. If you've included job and wage goals, wages obviously will change, and if they're not indexed to some kind of an inflationary standard, they're going to become stale and out of date. So, it's if you've ingrained this into your normal sort of economic development planning process, I don't revisiting it every 3 years is probably appropriate. You could do it more or less frequently than that. It really just depends on the changes that might be happening in your community.
Perfect. Okay. Our last question for right now is in regards to the developer fee policy. How much should they request from developers as far as an application fee and escrow goes?
Sure. So the amount, can vary. And what the general recommendation is that the developer cover all the costs associated with the things that you need to do as a community to pay for third-party expenses to provide the assistance, right? So ultimately, at the end of the day, the agreements and everything you put in place means they should pay for all of it. But what we will typically see is that your application will include a fee, and that can be a smaller fee. We see that range anywhere from $1,500 to $3,000. And I think, probably on that higher end is more appropriate. But that's going to require them to write a check, submit the application, and then that amount is usually enough for a community to understand whether that is going to meet its policy goals, whether there is truly a gap in the project and the amount that's being requested is within reason or needs to be potentially adjusted, usually downward. And that will get you to a point where you can get in front of your elected officials to see whether they agree and want to pursue moving forward with the project. And so that's kind of fee number one. Then usually what happens is you get into some kind of a term sheet or a preliminary development agreement situation. At that point, many communities will ask for upwards of $10,000 deposit to cover out-of-pocket costs. And then depending on how much it costs on a going forward basis, those agreements will say that once those funds run dry, a developer would be required to replenish those and continue paying for those costs. And I know a lot of places are hesitant or concerned about asking developers to do that. But what I can tell you is good developers that want to do work in your community understand that this is a need. They are willing to pay these costs. They understand it's a cost of doing business. And when you look at it as a line item on their total development costs, it really isn't as much as it sounds, right? To us, it's a lot of money, but we're often talking about multi-million-dollar projects. So don't be shy about asking for it. Good developers are willing to put it up.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jason. That's all the questions that we have right now for you. So I'll let you continue the presentation.
Great. Thanks, Keith. So we're going to move into how these policies, principles, sort of best practices have played out in real life. And I think this is what folks are probably most interested in anyways. It's always fun to see how these things do come to fruition out there in real life. And so the example I wanted to start with is the city of Robbinsdale. And, Robbinsdale, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It's a great community with just a tremendous downtown and a lot of really great things going for it. I mean, it's a downtown that I think would be the envy of a lot of different communities, just in terms of, its physical shape and structure, but also some of the mix of businesses that are down there. I mean, they've got several incredible restaurants, a bakery, a butcher shop that's been there for many years and is widely known, a brewery. So it's really kind of that great mix of things that everybody wishes they had in their downtown. But Robbinsdale was really kind of looking around and had a lot of other opportunity, a lot of underdeveloped sites, like a lot of these inner ring suburban communities do, and really wanted to see things happen there to supplement all of the great things that were happening in their downtown. And really didn't know where to start, right? They knew they had a lot of sites that had potential, but really weren't quite sure which of them made the most sense to start with. And so this was an example where, the city was proactive in terms of trying to identify opportunities for redevelopment. And this started, as I mentioned, that with engaging developers directly in what we sort of call roundtables. And the city really said, we have about 10 sites that we think could be redevelopment candidates, and invited in several developers and just got a lot of feedback about those sites and learned a lot in that process. It really helped narrow down and focus on those that were best suited for redevelopment and those with opportunity that were most likely to occur in the near term. And out of that process, by narrowing those sites down, by focusing on the ones that were potentially going to be the most successful, identified 3 sites and ultimately ended up completing 3 projects, significant projects on 3 of the sites that were looked at through that developer roundtable process. The first one is the former Terrace Theater site, and some of you may be familiar with this. This actually ended up being somewhat controversial just because of the love of the Terrace Theater that had been located there and some of the history that went along with that. But you can tell from the aerial photo here that really a really underutilized site. The Terrace Theater, long story short, was beyond saving. And the rest of the site was occupied by what was a former Rainbow grocery store and then an attached strip mall, essentially, that was largely vacant. The Rainbow had left the site, and there really wasn't a whole lot happening there. And one of the challenges with it was that this is owned by really an absentee landlord out of New York that just really wasn't paying much attention to the property and really wasn't engaging locally in trying to do anything with respect to redevelopment. What ended up happening is that one of the developers that participated in the roundtable process was able to go out and talk with the folks that owned the real estate there. They really had to bird dog these folks and were really aggressive about pursuing them to try and get the site under control for acquisition. And so the city, this was privately owned land that the city wanted to see redeveloped. The city did not have to step in here and acquire property or do any of that. It really just worked with the developer that knew that if they could secure the site, they had a partner in the city to help offset some of the financial needs that were there. And with that, armed with that information, they went out there and did all of that work on their own. And they were able to secure the site and got it under contract, worked with the city and found that it was going to be workable for a redevelopment tax increment district. And then about that same time, Hy-Vee was coming into the marketplace here and identified this site as one that they would like to use to locate a new grocery facility. And so they were able to do that. The new Hy-Vee site got built here, and the city, through a combination of using redevelopment tax increment and a grant from DEED for cleaning up some contamination that was found here, were able to pull this project off and get it built. So a great success story that came out of one of those roundtable examples. And just up the road between the Hy-Vee site and downtown was another location, and this was a site that had a bank, Citizens Bank, just to the south on the map there, the bottom of the map, and then also an older office building as well as a couple single-family homes that were available for acquisition. And the developer here had a relationship with the bank owner, who decided they didn't need as much real estate as they were currently occupying. A lot of it was parking that wasn't necessary anymore, and we've seen bank footprints shrinking over the years. And so this was a great opportunity to better utilize some of that real estate. And then when combined with the old office building that the developer already happened to own and the 2 single family properties, created a pretty nice development site. And so that particular site became what is known today as Birdtown Flats. So this is a multifamily project, 152 market rate units of housing. The city was able to create a redevelopment tax increment district, worked with the developer to negotiate a tax increment package that was advantageous to both the city and the developer. And that was used to offset the extraordinary redevelopment costs on this site. And the picture there, this project is now open and has tenants in it, and turned out great. You can have views of downtown and of the lake there in Robbinsdale. So it's a really really great project. And these folks now have, walkable distance to the downtown. And then the last site in Robbinsdale, which is just north of where Hy-Vee got developed, the road to the south, 36th Avenue, that's shown there, is the road separating the Hy-Vee site and this particular site. And this site is, it was a former American Legion building, a relatively small building on a large area of parking and some unutilized right-of-way. So a great opportunity for redevelopment here. This also housed a vodka bar, which I've never been in, but apparently is pretty popular with a lot of folks. And so many weren't happy to see that go, but both of these uses were on their way out, regardless of redevelopment. There was a willing seller here, and that created an opportunity to better utilize this site ultimately for redevelopment. And in this case, again, a redevelopment district, because of the condition of the building that was there, able to, again, take that underutilized site with very little value and put 197 units of high amenity rental on this site. And this had a combination of sources, a little more expensive project just because of the cost of acquisition. And then the site planning required that there be 2 levels of underground parking in this particular project. So some things that added to cost. So the city used redevelopment tax increment as well as grants from the Met Council and Deed to bring this project to fruition. So shifting gears a little bit to the city of Pine City, and this is an example of a reactive case study. And for those of you that don't know where Pine City is, it is located right along Interstate 35, pretty much midway between the Twin Cities and Duluth. And it's a great community with a lot going for it and a lot of activity happening. And they did spend a fair amount of time thinking through how they wanted to react to some requests for assistance that were coming in, work to create really more of a process and an application so that when folks did come forward, that they had things in place to be able to react. And they had done some work around knowing that they needed to include more housing, as many communities in greater Minnesota are finding a tremendous need for housing in the community. And they really were wrestling with what can we do to promote more housing in the community. And when a developer came forward proposing housing, the city was in a position to both understand that they wanted that development in their community and to be able to react to the request for assistance that came along with that. So they asked the developer in this case that came forward to complete the application process, submit that to the city, and start working through the request in the manner that I've kind of outlined. In this case, the developer had control of about a 6-acre site, and they were proposing 103 units of senior housing. And this was going to be more of that continuum of care. So there was going to be, independent living, assisted living, on through to even some memory care units. And the trick for them was a $20 million project. And the developer here was Summit Development, was to try and understand how to make the project financially feasible. So they came, to the city with a particular challenge. They were going to not only provide a $20 million project, but some of the units were going to be considered affordable. And so, how do we do that? And the developer, was requesting $3 million of tax increment over 20 years. And really this got back to that need to discuss their pro forma and doing an analysis about whether there is that need or not. But it also really became, as I mentioned, trying to understand what and clarify really what is the request that's being made here by the developer. Because when we ran the numbers to try and understand the potential here for tax increment, we weren't going to get to $3 million. And a lot of that was a function of the fact that the likely assessed value and the taxes that were going to be paid for this project were much less than the developer was assuming. And so again, that's where I talk about making sure everyone's on the same page with these assumptions. And so the value that was provided, the likely valuation, about $60,000 a unit. I mentioned that the developer's cost was about $202,000 a unit. So you can see there was a bit of a disconnect here, some concern on the developer's part that, what happens if the values are much higher? I'm going to spend $20 million. I don't want to have to be on the hook for this huge tax bill that I'm not anticipating. But when through all that discussion, the outcome of that was really what the developer was saying is, I need an offset on my operating expenses for a 20-year period. Not so important on the amount, it's just that they need that offset to make this thing financially feasible. So again, getting on the same page about what really the need was and clarifying that up front really made this whole process a lot smoother on the back end. And in this case, what was able to be agreed to was a tax increment note of $1.6 million, not $3 million. And it's likely that that's going to pay off much sooner than 20 years, but the city allowed up to 19 years, trying to meet that developer request again. And so there was some negotiation there and likelihood that the ultimate assistance may be less than the developer was requesting. This project broke ground actually in 2019, December, but ran into some COVID-related delays. We've since been in contact with the developer here, and they're restarting, have their financing in place, and are hoping to really start construction now in earnest in 2021. So again, back on track, and ultimately a great outcome for the city, and an example that was really sort of a reactive way to approach development. And then the last example that I would like to touch on is in the city of Dayton. And this one is interesting, and it's a little different. I consider it's a reactive example, but takes on a little bit of a different flavor. The city of Dayton was very good about being what I call ready for development. They have a strategic plan. They know what they want to accomplish, and that piece ended up being very important in this case. This particular part of the city that we're going to be talking about was guided for industrial development. It's in a corridor in the northwest part of the Twin Cities that, as many of you know, is extremely hot right now for industrial development. And so they wanted to leverage that position that they have in the marketplace to have some job creating and tax base creating uses happen in an undeveloped area of their city. This area, they have hundreds of open acres ready for development. And it's a little unusual and unique, but puts them in a strong position going forward. So they were ready, approached by a national site search firm with the possible development of something called Project Launch. And so many of you have worked on these sort of double secret projects that might get presented to you, right? They don't want to disclose who the user is. They want to keep that under wraps. They require all of the parties involved to sign non-disclosure agreements, so you can't divulge who the potential user might be. And they're conducting these searches on a national basis. This isn't just looking at the city of Dayton and the city next door, right, and trying to compare which of those is the best option. These are competing for investment at a national level in this case, but you've seen these projects where you might even be competing globally. And so you can understand why it might be important in those cases that you be prepared and be ready to be able to be successful securing that investment. And in this case, the fact that the city was prepared, that they had all of their ducks in a row, really helped them secure this investment. And some of the ways that they did that, the big one here is that they made investments in the corridor that they wanted to see develop. And the big one here is along Interstate 94 as it heads northwest out of Maple Grove towards Rogers and up towards Monticello. If you're familiar with that stretch of road, one of the challenges there, particularly for Dayton, was that there's an exit and interchange on 94 at Maple Grove Parkway, and then there isn't another one until I think over 5 miles later in the city of Rogers at 101. And so in the works for many, many years has been an interchange in between there at what's now called Dayton Parkway. And so the city has been engaged for decades, I'll venture, to try and get this interchange built. And it's now coming to fruition. The interchange is under construction. And the city, dedicated dollars, in this case, upwards of $4 million to help get that interchange built. And in addition to that, they've worked in that general vicinity around where that interchange will occur to prepare those sites for development. So they've made infrastructure investments through other projects that have come forward, leveraging tax increment to build out road and utility infrastructure in the area. They've been, very proactive in terms of indicating to the development community that they're open to talking about what kind of opportunities it might exist to, make their projects feasible in these areas. And what I'll say is, working with these national site searches, one of the key things that you need to consider is just making sure that you're creating a welcoming process that's in there, right? These site search firms and ultimately the companies that they represent just want to be able to make sure that they can see a clear path getting from point A to point B. And if they are working with a community where that is evident, then they feel a lot more comfortable making that investment in the community. And in this case, the project launch was successful. Coming to the community, they talked about 500,000 square feet of space. 90% of that is going to be manufacturing and lab testing and demonstration, and 10% of it office. So again, I talked about job density. This is a more job dense use. There are folks there with wages as indicated there that are averaging about $65,000 a year, and 225 total jobs is the commitment, right? And so generally that is probably going to be exceeded, but that's a lot of jobs, a lot of high paying jobs for a facility like this with an $85 million total investment. And that's everything: real estate, equipment, everything that goes along with that. And one of the key pieces here was that not only was the company intending to purchase the site to build the 500,000 square feet, but was also intending to purchase all of the land that was controlled by a particular development entity that they were acquiring it from, which was several more acres. And if they were to purchase that, would be with the intent of securing that site to grow their whole corporation on a going forward basis. So it also meant the potential for an incredible amount of future investment. So again, a lot at stake with making sure that there was success here. And what the city was trying to overcome in this case was as I said, we're comparing the cost to do business here on the site in Dayton to what it costs in other locations that they were considering to invest. And the chart that I put up there shows a comparison about the site in Dayton versus their out-of-state option. And you can see there ultimately is about a $31 million differential. And a lot of that is driven by the labor costs. And what we find here in Minnesota is that we don't stack up well often on the cost of labor, but we do stack up better with the quality of that labor force, the education of that labor force, and a lot of other intangibles. And so, we're never going to overcome that entire differential, but the package that the city put together was an attempt to try and, do the best that they could to overcome that particular differential. And I would say that, when we talk about other local incentives on that chart, we're still $5.7 million under the other option that the company was looking at. And that's not uncommon for us in Minnesota. We don't have huge toolbox here. We've got, this is talking about full tax increment at 3.3 million, and deals like this, as you know, out there, really all we can add to that is some of this funding that the state might bring to the table. And those awards, average, right around anywhere from 500 to maybe 1.5 million. So that's all we can do as a state to compete. We're never going to be able to provide $9 million in local incentives. But again, it wasn't necessary to compete as a mitigating that entire $31 million differential, just to try and start to level the playing field and let all the other intangibles that we do offer here in the state take over and help in the decision-making process. So in the end, it was finally revealed what is Project Launch. Well, it was Graco. and they're already present here in the market. They have facilities in Minneapolis, facilities in neighboring Rogers, and they were going to build this 500,000 square foot facility in addition to, as I said, potential future expansion. But they did go ahead and select the city for its site. We've gotten through approval of a new TIF district, an economic development district for them, and an agreement in place, all of which the business wanted done before even deciding whether they were going to select this location. So a little unusual in that regard. And right now they're working through their land use entitlements, and the intent is that they would begin construction this year. So again, a little different example of how a community was reactive, but positioned well for success and able to capitalize on that and secure a pretty substantial investment in their community. So that does it for my examples. I'm going to bring Keith back in, and then we're happy to do any of the other questions that might have arisen as we've been talking here.
Awesome, Jason. Thanks. A lot of great information you just shared right there. So we have a few questions. I'll start with the first one. It's in regards to Robbinsdale. And someone was just asking if you could provide more context around the developer roundtables. Specifically, how many developers did they reach out to? How do they contact the developers to request a meeting? And then how long did the process take from doing the developer roundtables to project completions with the three examples that you shared?
Yeah, so, we actually helped facilitate those meetings in Robbinsdale. In that case, I think there were 6 to 8 developers, mostly because we weren't sure for every site exactly what type of developer interest there might be, right? So if we know we've got a housing site, for example, we may only reach out to those that develop housing, and then that list might be a little smaller. But typically with the roundtables, anywhere between 4 to 10 different perspectives is how that ends up working out. Those meetings, pre-pandemic, we were able to do those at City Hall, and we're able to schedule them. We were able to reach out to those folks and coordinate those meetings. We just typically will block off, 4 hours at a time on a couple different days and just run through the meetings. So that process in and of itself doesn't take very long, right? I mean, we can get through a developer roundtable process in a few weeks. And that's going to provide you with feedback, but not necessarily a project, right? And so you've got the feedback, you've potentially generated some interest, and then from there, it's really the follow-up. And I would say that, from the start of these meetings to fruition on all of these projects, and remember, some of this is happening mid-pandemic, took about 4 years, right? From the very start to occupancy in some of these projects. Now, Hy-Vee went first. That only took about maybe a year and a half from the initial roundtables because that was ready. And then these other projects followed, just happened to follow one another, each year. So, you can see results right away. Typically, it really just depends on the site and, what it is it's trying to be accomplished.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. It looks like we only have time for one more question, so I want to jump into this one for the city of Dayton. So working with MnDOT on the interchange doesn't sound easy. Did the city of Dayton cost share the interchange with MnDOT, county, and others? How did they determine the value that was going to be attributed to the city?
So yeah, it's a good question. These interchanges are a multi-jurisdictional effort, and they do take an awful long time. As I said, this was about, I think, $20 to $25 million total project cost to build that interchange. It was shared among all the jurisdictions that Keith mentioned. The city's share of that was about $4 million. That's determined through a cost sharing formula that I don't fully understand, but that's a pretty typical, I'll call it percentage for the local share. And then all the other funding comes in on top of that. It really is about all a community like that can really afford to bring to it. And in their case, what they were able to do is bring some upfront dollars. They did do some debt associated with that project, but they did do an area-wide assessment to benefiting properties, which is something to think about for folks that may have one of these happening in their communities and thinking about ways to pay for it.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason. That's all we have time for today. I want to thank Jason for his insights and time, and I want to thank all of you for taking the time out of your day to join us. Please note both a copy of today's presentation and a recording of the session will be posted to your virtual attendee hub for your future use and reference. And because we're always interested in learning about ways we can make your virtual experience more dynamic and deliver content that is most valuable to you, we will send you a very brief survey in the coming days. We hope that you take the time and fill it out and let us know how we did so that we can better serve your needs. Thank you again for attending and enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.